you would never guess that a king of England was born there. So we did a few things, because my wife and I joined a group, and we managed to get a life-size statue of Henry put up in front of the castle, which means that nobody can be in any doubt now. But also I had the idea for the Tudor trilogy that Henry would be born in the first book and then come of age, if you like, in the second book, and become king in the third book. And while I was writing the third book, I decided that the story of his young daughter, Mary, who was just a little girl, who was kind of nursing him in his last months, was just such a fascinating story. The way that her little brother, also called Henry, promptly married her off to the ailing King of France. And she just seemed to go along with it, which I suppose she didn't have any choice. And that got me looking quite closely at this chap, Charles Brandon, and who I only knew from the Tudors television series, if I'm perfectly honest. And we went and visited his house in Westhorpe and his tomb in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. And I got to know them really well. And then his last wife, after Mary died, was his ward, his 14-year-old ward, Catherine Willoughby. And of course, her story, I hardly knew anything about Catherine Willoughby at all. And her story was even more fascinating, because she was the spokesperson for the Protestant cause at the time when Queen Mary came to the throne. And that was nearly disaster for the whole family. And she had to escape to exile. And that whole story was fascinating to research and write. I didn't manage to follow all her footsteps in exile, but that took me up to the coronation of Elizabeth I. So it was quite easy to decide what to do next. It was an Elizabethan trilogy. The only trouble is I started trying to decide which of the Elizabethans to do, because rather than write about Elizabeth directly, I wanted to show all the different facets of her strange personality through the eyes of her favourites. That's what I decided to do. And it was fairly easy to start with Drake, because as a boy I'd been in Plymouth and I knew the statue of Drake. But what I found was almost everything I was taught at school about Francis Drake was actually wrong, including his famous game of bowls, as the Armada is cited, and that he single-handedly defeated the Armada. You know, it was all Victorian sort of hero making. And when you look at the actual story, it's quite a different story. You get a picture of this rather insecure man with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, because he was from really common stock. His father was a farmer and then a preacher, but he certainly wasn't a noble. And Drake would have loved to have been a noble. And the nobility, of course, never accept a commoner as one of them. Never, not for any reason. And even when he was knighted, they still looked down their noses at him, and he went to his grave wondering how he could ever get round that problem. So that's where it started. And I'm now writing about a chap that suddenly appeared halfway through writing Drake. He was about to set sail, and this young chap came charging down on a horse from London, stole one of his ships and sailed off into the sunset. And he said, well, what's going on? And it was Robert Devereux. And when he eventually, Earl of Essex, and when he eventually caught up with Devereux, he said, why did you steal one of my ships? And he said, well, I asked the Queen's permission to sail with you. And she said, absolutely not, under any circumstances. So I stole a horse and rushed to Plymouth and stole a ship. And I thought, this is just such a character. I know other books have been written about him, but I'm going right from his boyhood days when his father was poisoned in Ireland. He was Essex. He was Walter Devereux, the Earl of Essex. And he was poisoned mysteriously during a meal. First of all, his servant died, and then he fell ill and died, leaving his family bereft, you know, and without any money. He was in debt. So how Robert Devereux went from there is quite an interesting story to write. But the thing is, while I was doing that, I started to get interested in Elizabeth's ladies at court. And there's such a fascinating bunch. I couldn't choose between them which one might be book 3. And so I've decided to make it an Elizabethan series and do 3 men and 3 ladies. So the third man is going to be Walter Raleigh, who was another hero of mine when I was at school. And I'll be interested to see how wrong I was taught about him as well. And then I'm looking forward to doing the 3 ladies. But of course, the research has a lot of crossover because they all lived at the same time in the same places. So it's quite handy for me. I can go to somewhere like the Tower of London and research several books at once.
Sure. And you personally sail, so did you feel a connection?
Well, that's right. We've been caught in a storm where we had 25-foot high waves. It was known as the Boscastle storm because the village of Boscastle in North Devon was completely trashed as a result of it, and all the boats that were in the harbour ended up on the Welsh coast, and we were actually at sea at the time. And so it was only because we had a very good boat that we survived that. But it turned out to be a handy experience, because when I was writing about Drake in a storm in The Golden Hind, I could very much envisage what it might have felt like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That sounds petrifying, and I'm glad that you survived it. And I'm also glad that you had that experience. That's absolutely terrible.
But we didn't. We made it safely back.
Yeah. I'm having nightmares of like the movie, A Perfect Storm, or all of those different.
It was a bit like that. Sometimes the mast was 40 feet high, so we could measure the height of the wave against the mast, and we could see that the waves were at least 25 feet. And it was like sailing into a wall of water, but you have to hold your nerve, because if you turn sideways on,
then you get
it might broach you then. So you have to go straight into the wave with the pointy end of the boat and just hope for the best.
Yeah, I'm better you than me. So tell me about what Plymouth was like, because much of your book is set in Plymouth. Tell me about Drake's Plymouth.
It's fascinating. There's so much I've learned about Plymouth. Unfortunately, because of the lockdown, I haven't been able to visit Drake's house in Plymouth, but I went in on Google Earth and I was able to pinpoint his house. And I realized then something which none of his biographers seems to have picked up on, that from his house, you could see the harbour in Plymouth. And although it was in like the merchant's row of houses, his particular house had an open parkland in front of it, which gave him a view of all the ships coming and going, which makes sense, doesn't it? When you know that, you can see why he would have chosen that house, because he was a millionaire. He could have any house he wanted, but he chose to live in Plymouth and to have a little office in the docks when he could have been anywhere he wanted in the world, really.
Yeah. So you mentioned about how he came from a father who was a preacher. How did he become a sailor?
Well, sailing was in their blood because they lived at Chatham Dockyard in Kent. And so his father used to preach to the sailors, you see, on all the ships. And Drake was the eldest of 12 brothers. That must have been quite a family. Most of his brothers seem to feature in the book at some point or other. A lot of them crop up because they all tried to cash in on his success, you see. Yeah. And it was one of the things that you did was you either joined the church or went to sea. There weren't a lot of choices. You could be a tenant farmer, but Drake wanted to make his fortune, and he actually became like an apprentice on a Channel pilot ship it wasn't really a ship. It was, you've probably seen pilot boats. They're really quite small, but they're captained by people that know all the dangers of the area. And the skipper of the boat, when he died, he left Drake the boat in his will, and he presumably thought Drake would just carry on the tradition and spend the rest of his life piloting ships across the channel. But he promptly sold it, and then used the money to buy a fancy sort of new clothes and try and pass himself off as an experienced sailor down in Plymouth, when in fact he'd never been further than the Bay of Biscay. But I think he kind of gave the impression that he'd served his time before the mast, you know.
You have him in the book saying that he's related to Hawkins, and it's kind of a little bit dubious.
It's interesting because they all claim to be all related to each other, and in fact, bearing in mind the small families, and you know the smaller numbers of families in a town than you get these days, there was a lot of sort of second and third cousins and things like that, and they used to use that as a foot in the door. But the real Drake nobility were furious when he tried to take their coat of arms as his own. He wouldn't have any of it, you know. so he wasn't that closely related to everybody. And a few times he kind of admits there's a bit of a tenuous link. But if you look back through family trees, they're all connected in some way or other.
Sure. And with the Hawkins, he had, throughout the book, he has kind of there's a tense relationship with them. Can you tell me about?
It's strange because the two brothers were like chalk and cheese, really. And John Hawkins, of course, was a notorious slave trader, but he had a very old-fashioned set of values. So he was very much one to lead from the front and not to ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself and all those kind of things. And it's so hard to not apply modern standards to that and to keep reminding yourself about the context of the time where slavery was a new thing, and nobody really seemed that troubled by it. Well, Drake was troubled by it. And
right.
He's actually written about that. And he turned that concern to his advantage in quite a spectacular way by forming an alliance with the Cimarrons, who were the escaped slaves that could have either murdered him or handed him to the Spanish as for ransom, you know, for a reward. But instead, they were the making of him, because it was through the Cimarrons that he managed to understand how to survive in the Panamanian jungle and how to hijack the mule trains that brought the silver across. And of course, nobody expected him to do that. They just thought they would patrol the seas and that would do the job. They never thought anybody would head off across land. And as you know, the geography of Panama is quite curious. That's why they built the Panama Canal there, because it gets very narrow in the middle. So you can actually walk across, if you've got the nerve to do it, you can walk across from the West Indies to the Southern Ocean, which we now call the Pacific, but at the time it was generally known of as the Southern Sea or the Southern Ocean. And there's a story about how Drake and John Oxenham climbed a particularly high tree and could see both oceans. Now, I'd love to do that and see if it's possible after the lockdown, perhaps. But it's a nice idea that you could see both oceans. And of course, the Southern Ocean was like El Dorado to them, because it was where the Spanish gold was all coming from, and silver and diamonds and jewels. So it was just beyond their wildest dreams, literally. But how could they get there? That was the problem, because nobody had ever done it and survived, even Magellan, of course.
Right. And yeah, how were the Spanish do it? They just had the experience of, you talked about kind of when he was going down across on the trip, and I'm skipping ahead here in time, but they would patrol that area, Tierra del Fuego, and they just were kind of used to it then by that point.
Yeah. So that it was their most closely guarded secret. But fortunately for Drake, he was a kind of amateur cartographer and liked to draw his own maps and sketch all the different coastlines and harbors and reefs and things, islands, as he went along. Sadly, a lot of that was presented to Queen Elizabeth and has been lost. So we live in hope that one day an archivist will open an old chest, and there will be all Drake's notes. So most of what we see today are copies drawn from memory by other people, perhaps even 20 years afterwards. But still, we do have his letters and his journals and ship's logs and all of that kind of thing. And Ferdinand Magellan actually documented his voyage through the strait, what we know as the Strait of Magellan. And so Drake was able to rely on that and his own maps to actually find the secret route. But when they emerged at the other end, of course, they emerged into the worst storms that anybody had ever seen in their lives, so bad that the only ship to survive that was the Golden Hind, which started life as the Pelican and then became the Golden Hind, of course. And worryingly for Drake, some of the other ships turned back. He wasn't sure whether they'd been captured by the Spanish and would tell the Spanish where he was, or whether they'd go back to England and say, bad news, it's all gone horribly wrong, because he wasn't there to defend his good name, you see. So,
and there was trouble on that voyage earlier on.
Very much so.
Yeah, and he had to have a trial at the same place where Magellan had a trial.
There was a few things I had to deal with, which I didn't have any idea when I started how on earth I was going to deal with it. And then I stumbled across this curious reference that Drake's first wife, Mary Newman, was a fairly ordinary Plymouth girl, and on the face of it, an ideal wife for an ambitious young sailor, because her own father had been a sea captain and her brother was a sailor. So they were all from the same kind of background. And then there was this reference to something going on between his wife and another member of the crew, another of his captains. I'm torn here between giving the whole plot away or not. But Drake, the last thing he needed was a mutiny on his hands, and that's exactly what was brewing, was a full-blown mutiny. And it's really curious about how history repeats itself, because Magellan had exactly the same problem, and the way he dealt with it was that he hung the mutineers at this particular place. And Drake found himself at that specific place reading Magellan's notes when he was wondering how to deal with the mutiny. But I find that fascinating and curious as well. And I believe that he regretted his decision for the rest of his life. I don't think it ever sat comfortably with him. And as he sailed back, he had two big worries on his mind. The first was, is Queen Elizabeth still alive, or has she been replaced by somebody else who might not take kindly to me? And secondly, are there going to be consequences for what I've done? And so that was quite interesting. And the first, before he even set foot ashore, he hailed another boat as they approached Plymouth and said, is the Queen still living? And they said, yeah, the Queen's still living, but we're all dying of the plague. So that's quite interesting now, isn't it? Because that's the same kind of answer you get if you went into Plymouth now.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm looking through my notes and I have highlighted a description, and it's just really innocuous. It's just kind of in here. And I want you to elaborate on what it was like for people sailing at this time, because you have a savage seahorse with huge tusks as large as a grown bull reared from the water with a roar. Tell me about that.
Well, I could tell you that um, I was a child in Kenya, and I grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to visit Lake Nakuru and see hippos. And uh, on our wedding anniversary, my wife and I went back to Kenya, and we went out on the lake in a very small skiff with a Kenyan at the helm. And there were hippos there with little babies, and one of the hippos reared out of the water quite viciously as we approached. And I said to him, do they ever attack? Thinking he would say, no, don't be silly, they're tame, they're like puppy dogs, you know. And he said, yeah, they do attack. Yeah. And we had about 6 inches of freeboard in this little boat. And I said, what do you do if they attack? And he says, oh, gun the engine and get back as fast as we can. So I wouldn't recommend a trip on Lake Nakuru if you fancy it. But what Drake's crewmen encountered, of course, was the first hippo that anybody from England had ever seen. And so they could only describe it as a sea monster, because you know, it was actually in the river estuary, and it must have been terrifying because it actually sank the little dinghy that they were in. So they weren't so lucky as we were in Kenya. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with the llamas. They called them the long-necked sheep, because they'd never even heard of a llama. They'd never seen a llama, but they could relate it to the sheep that they knew of.
And wasn't the penguin I feel like I remember it was Welsh, right? Whitehead's penguin.
Right. Yeah. Yes, right. And don't you find it fascinating that because it was a Welshman who dubbed them that name in the crew, and that's documented, and that survived to this day, but nobody ever thinks of it. Nobody ever realizes. But they weren't exactly environmentalists, because when they found an island densely populated with penguins, they killed every last one of them and put them in the hold, and rubbed their hands together because they thought, we'll have penguins to eat for the rest of the voyage. Right. So they were easy to catch. I didn't want to make too much of it in the book because of some people's sensitivities, but that's quite a vicious way of traveling around the world, really, isn't it? Yeah. Is to literally exploit any natural resource you come to, because they couldn't possibly carry enough food or water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's hard to read the early stories, even with settlers in America and the bison and all of.
Yeah. They just shot them all, didn't they? They, for sport, they would shoot as many as they could until they ran out of ammunition.
Yeah, different sensibilities. Thank goodness hopefully one would think we evolve, although it's not always clear. Speaking of different sensibilities, I wanted to ask what it was like for you writing about his voyage that he was on when there was slaves. Like how was that for you writing about that?
Isn't it interesting how quickly things can change? Because obviously I was sensitive to the issues around slavery and the callous way that John Hawkins would, if he couldn't sell his slaves, he'd just put them ashore wherever and hope for not even hope for the best, never give them a second thought, really. So that happened all of the time, really. And I was pleased to find in Drake's journals that it really troubled him, and that he got a bit of a reputation for going the extra distance to worry about the welfare of slaves and try and get them spread out amongst different ships, when everybody else thought that was just a waste of everybody's time, you know. And of course, whenever he caught any Spanish ships with slave support, he freed them, and he gave them the choice of either joining his crew, which was quite a good option because they'd have a share of the profits then, or to be put ashore when it was possible. And he gave them food and money. Some of them he gave like bags of silver, stolen Spanish silver, but he did really do his best to look after them as far as he could. And Diego is a fascinating character because he became Drake's, the son he never had, his best friend, and literally gave his life to save Drake's. And that is documented from half a dozen different contemporary accounts that it's not, in fact, I didn't have to make anything up at all. This is one of those books where it's a case of not what do I have to make up to add depth to it, but what can I leave out without losing, without, you know, and still give a fair picture.
Sure. No, that I thought that was very redeeming of him when I first started reading it, and there was that part was very uncomfortable to read, but then seeing him kind of speaking up against it and doing the things that he could, it's like, all right, he's okay then for the time.
After I sent the book to my editor, we had the Black Lives Matter campaign, and then there was talk about pulling down Drake's statue in Plymouth and throwing it in the sea. And I agonized about whether to campaign on his behalf that what I've just told you, that he actually was way ahead of his time, really, and people should look at it and take a balanced view. And all of that happened in the short time between finishing the first draft and sending it off to my editor and then getting it back. And when I reread it through, I didn't change anything. I left it exactly as it was, because there was no need to change anything. People can make their own judgment. And I think that's the best way.
Definitely. Yeah, so I also then want to skip ahead to once he's successful and he's El Draco, because I live very close to Cadiz, and I would like for you, to talk a little bit about Khadith in the time that we have left.
Yeah, because I'm going to be writing about that again, because Robert Devereux was one of the heroes of Cadiz. But can you imagine the scene that the Spanish, because the story I was taught at school was that the Spanish Armada was so vanquished that nothing made its way back to Spain, nothing survived. And that's not true at all. Half the fleet survived, and it was in good enough shape that it could be fairly quickly rebuilt. They were very good at doing that. And, you know, a lot of the crewmen were still aboard, and they were all in Cadiz preparing for another armada. The last thing they expected was an English armada. I never even knew there was an English armada. Yeah. You know, they talk about the Spanish armada, but an English armada appears out of nowhere, completely ignoring the battery on the headland, which was taking pot shots at them all of the time. So at any time they could be killed. And they just went in amongst the Spanish ships, firing from both sides at point blank range, really. Reckless, absolutely reckless. And one of Drake's captains was horrified at their tactics and withdrew. And he tried to court-martial him for cowardice, you know. And another of his crewmen was killed, and he saw that as sort of collateral damage, really. So he'd become quite ruthless by that point. And part of the reason is that so many people that he'd known had been tortured by the Inquisition and burnt at the stake in the public square and things like that, horrific stories. Or somebody like John Oxenham was kept alive until the age of 80 and paraded through the streets as an example to others, which is awful, isn't it, in chains. And he was a young man when he was caught, an ambitious young adventurer. And, you know, so if you put all of that together, you can kind of understand that Drake had quite a grudge. And then you add to that Queen Elizabeth blatantly encouraging him. And as he walks out the door, she'll say something like, but don't let anybody know that it was my idea, you know. I'll deny it all. which she did, of course, even with Mary Queen of Scots. She denied it all, even though she signed the death warrant. So she wanted to have it both ways.
It took a lot of political skill for her to walk that line, though, didn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I've been to Cadiz a couple of times, and I always try and imagine running around, and they took the town, didn't like completely
Yeah.
for yeah.
But it was all, that was all bluster, because they couldn't possibly hold Cadiz.
Yeah.
But they liked the idea of taking, and Robert Devereux, I feel a bit sorry for Robert Devereux, because he was sent to take the town and hold it, an impossible job. And when he came back all sort of battered and bleeding, but still alive, they said, "Oh, you're back soon, you know." You come back a bit soon. And Drake was sat there sort of drinking champagne and looking out to sea. He wasn't leading the army into Cadiz.
Yeah.
But he'd done his bit, of course, because they did make sure that there never was another armada attack England ever. So that's quite interesting to think about. If they'd not done that, would Spain have had another go and applied the experience that they'd got? And one of the things that they only found out too late was there were only about 6 men guarding the Isle of Wight. Now, Drake knew that, and he was praying that the Armada wouldn't use the Isle of Wight as their stronghold. But the Spanish presumed that it was well defended and didn't dare hang around there. And in fact, they could have occupied it without a fight, because the small group of men that were on the beaches at the Isle of Wight would have just surrendered straight away, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. So if anybody has any questions for Tony about any of his books or Francis Drake, his new book, go ahead and type them in. And what do you think, like, if you had to just have an overall sentence about Francis Drake, or a couple of sentences, like, what do we need to know that wasn't what you were taught in school to understand Francis Drake and his impact on Elizabethan England? In just a couple of sentences.
He was the first commoner to really become friends with Queen Elizabeth I. And I'm talking about all day long secret meetings with her now, where nobody knows what they discussed. All the other people that she knew were nobles and descended from royalty. So Drake was a rough sailor, you know, and I think she was intrigued by that.
What was that like for him, meeting her?
He didn't know how to deal with it, because he asked the Hawkins brothers for advice on how he should conduct himself, and they were useless, because they'd never had all day long private meetings with the Queen. There was nobody to ask, so he just had to wing it. So he had a brilliant idea of suddenly producing enormous pearls the size of birds' eggs, or whole chests of gold. And then while she's still looking at the whole chest of gold, he has somebody carry in one that's full of rubies and another one that's full of silver. And this has all actually happened, and said, I can take this if you want, but if you want to hang on to it, that's fine, you know. And of course, she was in debt, because the wars in Ireland had really cost the royal fortune. And single-handedly, really, Drake bailed the country out, and the money that he brought back more than wiped out all of the debt. And interestingly, laid the way really for what then became the British Empire. Right. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is a whole nother debate.
Yeah.
But it would never have happened if the country had continued to be in debt. And now you'll be pleased to hear we're back in debt again. So there won't be a British Empire, I don't think.
So there are a couple of questions coming in. Casey says, "Hi, Tony and Heather. I'm curious who you have found the most fun to write about so far."
I always enjoy the one that I'm writing at the moment. So I'm really enjoying Robert Devereux, because he's such a character. And there's so many strange things. Like I suddenly found out that he lived at Lampthe Palace, which is a 20-minute drive from my house. And I've been there before. I had no idea that he lived there. And unlike everybody else who was in awe of Queen Elizabeth, Robert Devereux, even as a little boy, he backed away when she tried to kiss him and refused to be kissed. And that's kind of set the benchmark for the way he thought of her for the rest of time. And of course, that brought out a whole nother side of her then, because just the same with Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, you know, he couldn't believe she was able to resist his charms. Elizabeth couldn't believe that this young Earl, because he was an Earl by then, Earl of Essex, wasn't totally in awe of her. She found that quite entertaining as well. I think over all the books I've written, I've lost count of how many it is now, 13, I think. Unlucky for some, but Owen Tudor was the first one where I really had to do it the hard way, because there was so little known about him that I really had to dig and dig and dig and look through the Welsh journals and translate stuff from Latin. And what a story, you know, that he was the servant of the widowed Queen Catherine of Valois, and that they were thrown together in Windsor Castle. I don't know if you've been to Windsor Castle, but it's such an amazing place. And it's kind of amazing that story isn't better known, and that there aren't better television dramas about it, because out of that liaison came the whole of the Tudor dynasty.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's really amazing to think about them, and then that secret wedding and all of it. Yeah. So Cindy has a question regarding the experiences of fauna they had never seen. Were there any reports of encounters with those in Panama, such as snakes, spiders, etc., they were not familiar with? Did it have an impact on their progress, or were they prepared for it?
I mentioned earlier on that they never would have survived if it hadn't been for the Cimarrons, who were the former slaves that were living in that area and knew the terrain really well. And they would warn Drake and his crew about scorpions and certain spiders that had a poisonous bite. But snakes, even today, there's probably snakes there that people don't fully understand. So that was a really good example of how they never would have done anything like that if they hadn't have worked with the former slaves and treated them with respect and integrity, so that it was a partnership and not just exploiting them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's really a good way of looking at it. All right, so people should, to get the whole story on Francis Drake, at least your interpretation of Francis Drake, people should get the book. And where can they, is the book out now? Is it in pre-order?
There it is. It's been out. It's out this month. I did wonder about whether to delay the publication of it until next year, as I said earlier on, because it was released early because of lockdown. Because my editor wouldn't normally have been available, and she was in lockdown, homeschooling her children. So I was able to bring everything forward. So there's one benefit of being locked down at your own house. And I've also written a third of Devereux, which normally I wouldn't have started until this week. So I'm finishing that early as well.
Yeah.
But the book is doing well. It's ebook and paperback on 13 countries on Amazon. And I've also, for a change, I've put it through the other channels. So it's on all of the other things, Kobo, and I don't normally do that. I normally have them exclusive to Amazon, but I've thrown the net a bit wider this time.
Awesome. Good. So people who have devices other than Kindles can read them, the ebooks at least. Perfect. All right. Well, you have been very generous with your time and with sharing with us about Francis Drake. And I don't think there's any other questions. So I will just end it by thanking you, and I'm gonna go ahead and post this out on my feeds then too, if that's okay. Get more people
Thank
listening.
you very much for your time, all of you. And it's been fun talking about Drake again. He is quite a character. I didn't get to mention that my wife and I, just before the lockdown, we actually visited the Golden Hind in London and had a private tour of the ship. And that was amazing. It was so small, 151 feet long, and you couldn't really stand up on the gun deck. And Drake's cabin was tiny. And it made me realize, it was great because I was still writing at the time, and it made me realize what a heroic thing it was to sail right around the world in such a small boat, you know. But thank you very much.
You mean the replica one that's right there where all the restaurants and bars and all those places?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's
Yeah. I have a friend who lived right around there, and I would walk past there all the time and see
it's definitely worth the visit. And that ship, that's where I was going to do my launch of Drake, but because of the lockdown, I'm going to do a book signing when it's all over. But I recommend a visit to it. It's fascinating. But it's used to educate school children mostly. And definitely, and it's right next to the Southwark Cathedral.
Yeah.
Which is
and there's great views of Tower Bridge, so you can walk along the bank.
So it's really, really worth a visit. Well, I'd like to come back later
Yeah.
talk about Robert Devereux. So that's perhaps
Awesome.
for another day. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for being here, and get the book and enjoy Tony Rich's books. They're fantastic. So we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. Bye.